Hey everybody, we're going to learn the relative pronoun in this lesson, which is going to be another major key. This is the beautiful thing about learning a language at the beginning, is that every single chapter we're adding so much to our linguistic toolbox. We can do so much more. And now we're going to be able to say a whole lot more about nouns. That's what the relative pronoun and its relative clause that it will create is all about. So we have this in English, of course. The boy who cried wolf, let's say, gets punished. That's appropriately grim fairy tale material, right? So the boy who cried wolf gets punished. Well, in essence, the sentence is simply saying the boy gets punished. Because that's our main subject, that's our main verb, I guess a verbal phrase, gets punished. So what we have here is this extra information, who cried wolf. We can bracket that off and we can completely excise it from the sentence. The boy gets punished. The basic meaning is clear, but we want to say, well, who, tell us more about this boy. Which boy gets punished? What's his characteristic? And before we could have said, well, the wise boy. We have said ho, sophos, pais in Greek, right? But then when it comes to who cried wolf, what we have here is something that refers back to the boy, the who, and then this whole extra phrase that we have. What did he do? Well, he did something. He did this verbal phrase. He cried wolf. So what we're doing here is giving more information about the boy. This, what we have here, is our relative clause. And this who is our relative pronoun that starts that clause. The boy who cried wolf. So let's do something else and we'll actually get to see a case usage in English. A language where you might have said, well, we don't have cases in English, and you'd say, well, that's mostly true, but we do make a distinction between I and me. This is the subject, this is the object. We also, and this has probably frustrated you in the past, we make a distinction between who and whom. Well, what's that M? That M is the same thing that we have in a Greek word going from os in the nominative to on in the accusative. It's this nasal sound that marks the accusative, that marks the object case. So that's cool. That's kind of a bit of verbal archaeology, that M of whom is related to the N. But what does that mean? So we might say, to whom shall, let's be formal here, I direct this letter. Or we might say, to whom or to whomever it may concern. So why do we have whom here? Why is to who not right? Why would that not work? Well, what's the subject of this sentence? That's I, right? Nice nominative. And then we have verb, direct object. What is this to whom? Well, this is ultimately our indirect object. That's going to be the recipient of the letter. And in Greek, they would put this in the dative case. English, we don't have too many cases to work with, but we have a preposition, to, and then this is going to take an object of the preposition. It needs to be in an object case. It needs to be whom. So this is our English relative pronoun. We have who for the masculine and feminine, and then whom in the accusative of those. And then we have a simple which for our neuter. And of course, we tend to, we don't have grammatical genders. We wouldn't say that to whom, let's say we're talking to a chair. On whom should I sit? Well, sure, the chair might be feminine in some languages, but we would say which because it's an object. It's neuter. That's easy. We reserve this for animated things. That might be tricky. You might talk about your pet or your beloved animal as a who or whom. Others might call it a which. That might frustrate you. I'm often hard-pressed when I'm talking about babies. Are they whos yet? Do they have this kind of personhood that we could grammatically talk about, in a who, or are they more objects at this point? They're infants, they can't speak, they don't really have a personality, they might as well be a pet. Well, this is revealing about my own mentalities on these things, but let's forget that for right now and say, hey, we have an English relative pronoun, and case does make a difference here, at least in the masculine and feminine. So, as always, I'm not even going to erase this. Let's do the reveal of what I've already prepared for you down here. As always, to begin with, let's review some of the things that we know. And this is what we're doing here is forming the relative pronoun. And of course, the easiest thing to do here is just get out your book, look at the charts, and memorize. But while I've got this free medium of online video, let's take some time to explain what we've got going on. So we've got different charts, and you'll notice I'm leaving out the vocative. There is no vocative relative pronoun. You can't say, oh, who I address. No, they don't do that. You could say, oh boy, whom I love, but then that's a different case. So there's no vocative. So I've left that out across the board. We don't have that in either the singular or the plural. But we do have our first and second declension adjectives of the kind of type A with these long etas. And then we have the article here, which also shows etas rather than alphas. So what do we have going through? This is, we had some differences here. Os is not equal to ha, and this on is not equal to ta. But otherwise, our endings were very similar. A is equivalent to a. U, ace, u, we have that here with the article. O, a, o, same. And then again, we have the accusative problem here, but then this was the same. So these are the kind of problem areas where there's not perfect mapping. Here, we also had the interesting fact that there was no consonant. We just had a rough breathing before the nominative masculine and feminine articles. But throughout the rest, we did have these taws. So good. This is somewhat useful. This is nice to see this chart and see, oh, where do these things differ? Let's now write out the relative pronoun, and we'll see what we're dealing with. And what will strike you, perhaps most first off, is it looks a whole lot like the article. For those of you who are coming to Greek from Latin, where you have qui, quae, quod for the relative pronoun, those are very marked, those are very clearly different in Latin. In Greek, you can see it's already a much more subtle distinction. This is in part because Greek has an article which we've already seen can function somewhat relatively, but it's not the relative pronoun. This is the relative pronoun. Hos, he, ha in the nominative, and then in the genitive, who, hes, who. And then dative, ho, he, ho. And accusative singular, hon, hain, ha. Always going to be equal to the nominative and the neuter. We knew that one. That one was a giveaway. So before we go to the plural, what can we observe here? Well, we have this omicron sigma ending, which looks a lot like our second declension adjective right there. But then we have a ha that looks a whole lot like our article there. So we're kind of picking and choosing somewhere between. The rest are very similar to both. There's no differences here, except again, because the nominative is equal to the accusative, we have the same, just ending in omicron rather than omicron nu. But otherwise, it's predictable. But what has changed consistently? Well, we always have now rough breathing on all forms. And note that we also now have, as opposed to these forms of the article, we also have a acute accent. So I'm writing it as an acute here. In practice, if it's followed by another word, it will mainly be grave or grave. For the relative pronouns, you'll be seeing graves almost all the time. But note that wherever there was a taw here, we now have a rough breathing. And where there was no accent here, we now have an accent. And I think that's probably the easiest way not to think, well, to remember that this gets a sigma, that's different, But otherwise, the relative pronoun is identical to the article. Replace T's with H's, with rough breathings for taws, and then make sure that everything has an acute accent. And I say acute here, but of course we have the circumflex accents on the dative and genitive. That's something that we've gotten used to now. If there's an accent on the ultimate syllable of a word that is genitive or dative, it has a circumflex. So we're used to that by now, but still worth noting. So now once we get to the plural, well, what's that going to look like? Well, the same rules will apply. Hoi, marked, it's different from the article because it has an accent. Hi, and now we're going to have ha. That ta has been left, and now we just have ta, ha. Hones across the board. So as always, no way to really separate gender in the genitive plural. What do you think this will be? I think you'll be able to guess it. Hois, heis, and then hois again. Accusative plural now. Hus, has, long alpha. And then what's this going to be? Well, it has to be equal to the nominative, ha. So again, what are we looking at? We have the exact same, these had some weird moments. We had omicron not equal to omicron sigma. Here we just had the short omicrons. Good. Here, plural is much more regular. Here we could really just say everything needs a rough breathing, no more T's, and then make sure that everything has its appropriate accent. Acutes for the nominative and accusative, circumflexes for the genitive and the dative. All that's great, and you can memorize this and you can produce it for your own instructors or for yourself on an exam, because sometimes we'll ask, hey, give us this paradigm, we want to know. Let's see some of these in action. So let's start with that boy example, but we don't know how to say cried wolf. So let's say the boy who is wise flees. So what is our sentence here? We have, in English, a subject, we have a main verb, and then we have our relative clause that refers back to that subject. So we can translate hopais, good third declension adjective we just learned, who. So, well, what does this need to do to agree with the boy? Well, the boy is nominative, masculine, and singular. But what does who need to be? Well, its singularity and its masculinity are going to be determined by the boy. But then we need to look at, within its relative clause, what is its function? So we have who is wise here. Well, I'm going to mark this as relative clause with this R, and then a relative subject. This would be the relative predicate. This would be the relative verb. So it's the subject of a little phrase, who is wise. So it needs to be nominative. Within this phrase, that's going to determine that it's nominative. So we can look back up here and say, what's our nominative, masculine, singular form? Well, that's hos. So that's what we're going to need here. Hopais, the boy, hos, who is wise. So let's actually express that. St. This is a enclitic, of course, that allows this acute accent on the hos to stay acute. It doesn't need to go grave. And then wise, well, what does this need to agree with? It's going to be sophos, but then, or from the adjective sophos. Case number gender, well, it needs to agree with hos, and as we just determined, that was masculine, singular, nominative. So that's what we're going to have here too. Sophos, rhymes, it's easy. And then flees, present tense, third person singular, theoge, that's actually ultimately referring back to the pais. The boy who is wise flees. Good. So let's say, well, why is that kid wise? Well, maybe it's because I was teaching him. Y'all might disagree on that, and that's fine. So the boy whom I teach flees. Maybe it's because the instruction is that bad. So we have some similarities. Hopais and then theoge. No changes there. But how do we now handle this relative clause? Whom I teach. Well, we're going to have a relative items here. What's that I going to be? Well, that's nominative in English, so that's the subject. This is going to be the verb. And whom is the direct object of the teaching? Note that it's at the beginning of the relative clause. We wouldn't say in English, outside of maybe poetry, well, let's see. So the child I teach, we could go on. Well, that's a bit of a relative phrase in English. If the child I teach flees, well, that would mean the child who I am teaching flees. But let's say we just make a short sentence. Normally we would say, I teach the child, not the child I teach. Note that this word order has changed in English, and it also changes somewhat in Greek. So I teach is going to be expressed by what in Greek? That's going to be paideuo. And then hopais, whom. So now we need to be something. What is this? Well, this is the direct object of paideuo. It needs to be in the accusative. So it needs to be masculine, singular, accusative. So we can go back up to our chart and say, that's going to be hon. So hopais, hon, paideuo, and that's the end of the relative clause. So we can kind of put brackets there too. Flees. The child whom I am teaching flees. Well, that's great, but we also learned that the child, pais, could also be feminine. Hey, pais. Well, then this needs to change. It's no longer masculine singular accusative. It's feminine singular accusative. So we go back up to our chart and consult. Scratch it, but there's that hain. That's what we need. So we can just erase this omicron and replace it with an eta. Hey, pais, hain, paideuo, felge. So the child whom I am teaching, the feminine child, the girl I am teaching, that's what we would now have. The girl whom I teach flees. So let's do one last one before we run out. And let's say the soldiers whose weapons are in the house. What do we want to say these soldiers do? There's got to be a fun verb that we haven't used in a while. I can't think of anything. This is a problem of teaching the same thing. I'm just getting used to falling into your little ruts, I guess. So the soldiers whose weapons are in the house pursue the enemy. So we can let's forget about whose weapons are in the house. That's a relative clause. Let's do the rest of the sentence because we can. So the soldiers will be hoi stratiotes, well, in the singular, stratiotai in the plural, and then pursue the enemy. What's the verb for pursue? Well, that's dioko, and then we're going to need it to be plural to agree with hoi stratiotai. So diokusi, and then what was the word for the enemy? It was plural in Greek, tous polemius. So these soldiers are pursuing the enemy. Good. But we now need to say whose weapons are in the house. We need to put in a relative clause here. Well, this isn't going to be quite enough space, so let's magnify, as it were, and say, well, this whole thing fits in there. So whose weapons are in the house? Well, we're saying weapons are in the house. We can write that out. Hopla, and then this is a form that what gender is that? That's neuter. So it doesn't need asin, plural, it just needs esti, the singular, because that's how neuter nouns work. So hopla esti, and then en, te, oikia, as we have it. So weapons are in the house. So then we need whose. Well, what is that? That's a genitive of possession. And that's what we need here. So we need the genitive, but it needs to agree with hoi stratiotai, so genitive, but that needs to be both masculine and plural. That's going to be home. Well, that could be really any gender, but it is genitive and plural and refers back now to hoi stratiotai. This is what we call the antecedent, the thing that comes before. So this refers back to the antecedent. Hoi stratiotai, the soldiers, whose weapons are in the house, pursue the enemy. That's it. Not too shabby. Just over 20 minutes. That was a little long. Thanks for sticking with me. Let's do some examples. See you then.